So we are going to talk about creating healthy church systems in this first session. And I can nerd out on this, just to be completely honest and transparent. I love systems. I love processes. I love figuring out a path, how we get from point A to point B. And we're going to talk about some of that this morning in this particular session. Now, I will just tell you, in the 45 minutes that we have together, I am unpacking a 200-page book, and so it is impossible to be able to really go through everything in the detail. And so let me just say how much I appreciate the leadership, whoever did it, buying everybody a book. And so I hope you will take advantage of that. Come pick up your book that they have already purchased. I wrote the book, it was published February, this past February. I've been writing this book for about 15 years. I really have. I had the idea and started kind of putting ideas together long before I sought out, the publishing process and all of that. Actually, it was longer than 15 years because I was pastoring in Sulphur, Oklahoma, a small town in the southern part of the state. And it really kind of, I was just struggling with some things and thought, man, we've got to have better organization. We've got to figure out how to get some of this stuff done. So many things were falling through the cracks. Our church was growing. We were adding leaders. We were trying to add different discipleship steps and all those sorts of things, but it was just kind of all over the place. There was no real definable pathway, if you will, to anything that we were doing. And so I thought, okay, there's got to be some way that we can kind of put this stuff down on paper and make it where it happens more automatically. And so people don't fall through the cracks. Things don't just not get done that are supposed to get done that really help in the big picture of things. And so I began, it's really kind of interesting because I remember having a conversation with my now daughter-in-law, who was my son's girlfriend at the time. She was raised in church, a different church, and I was just asking her some questions about how does your church do this and how does your church handle these types of things and all that kind of stuff. And she was probably 17, 18 years old at the time. And so it's been a very, very long process of trying to just figure out systems and what that could look like in a local church. And I'll define all this and we'll talk about what all this means here in just a few moments. So I want to start by just talking about the condition of the church in America. We all know that the condition of the church in America, in a general, broad sense, is not good. Studies and different research tells us that 80 to 90% of churches are in decline. I think that if you look at even the Free Will Baptist statistics, it holds true to that. We're in a pastor shortage. We have many churches that are struggling. We are closing way more churches than we need to. Well, we don't need to ever be closing churches, in my opinion. But I mean, we're closing a lot of churches. And I say we. I mean, we're not like closing them, but I mean, churches are closing because of a lack of reaching people and because of a lack of finances. Congregations are growing older. They're not winning new, younger people. And so churches are just going through the natural life cycle. And so what happens? I deal with that in the book. I'm not going to really deal with the life cycle this morning just because of time. But churches are in decline. And of the 10 to 20% that are growing, again, there's studies that show that verify this, that most of those churches, even that report growth, are only growing by transfer growth. We saw this really big in the 90s and 2000s with the growth of the megachurch. And the megachurch really grew early on. And I'm not dissing the megachurch. I'm not talking bad about them. There's a place for them, and I'm thankful for them. And I'm glad that we've seen the rise of a lot of those churches. But in the early days, the megachurch grew mainly at the demise of the local church, the smaller churches. A lot of the smaller churches were losing members to the bigger churches because they had the glitzy programs and the great kids ministries and the playgrounds and the all that kind of stuff that the smaller church can't offer. But we've seen more of a change of that now. Even the megachurch is really focusing more, and they're doing, I think, a better job in discipleship and actually reaching people But we even see this in the smaller churches, especially in communities like where I am from in Oklahoma. There's a lot of churches in Oklahoma, especially rural churches, a lot of bivocational pastors, and so they own their home, they have a job, but they still feel called to pastor and all that. And so there may be 5 or 6, 7 churches within driving distance of some of those churches, and a lot of times we see those pastors that kind of move around from church to church, and congregations kind of follow them around, the ones that they didn't make mad at the old church, that's why they left. And so you guys know what I'm talking about. And so we see a lot of this just kind of moving of sheep, right? It's not really winning any new people, but hey, my church grew by 25 people last year, but you only baptized 1, or maybe 0. And so that's transfer growth. And so although I know there's opportunity and time for that, certainly when somebody moves into your area, we want transfer growth in those kinds of situations. And so it's not always bad, but we just need to understand that the statistics are really not that encouraging. They're not really that good. And so we need to understand that the church in America really is kind of sick. But the problem is a lot of times they don't recognize it, or they just don't know it. I share my story in the book, my personal story, and I'll try to be as brief as I can, but I think it's important for the illustration here to understand. Back in 2000, so 24 years ago, just this past couple of weeks ago was the anniversary of this event, but I was diagnosed with colon cancer. And I ended up in the hospital. It was the Wednesday night of the National Convention, 2000 in Anaheim, California. And on Wednesday night, we stood up for the invitation, and it was like somebody just stabbed me in the gut with a hot knife. I mean, I just had immense pain, ended up sitting back down, and long story short, ended up in an emergency room that night. They did some tests, inconclusive, told me I needed to have more tests, and they wanted to admit me in the hospital. And I said, man, I'm 1,500 miles from home. I want to get home. And so they did some things to help me get to feeling better. Finally got back to Oklahoma. Didn't even make it all the way home. Ended up going directly to the emergency room there because I was so sick again by the time I got there. After a few tests and that sort of thing, determined I had a tumor in my colon, on the outside of my colon. It had torn through. Did surgery, it was malignant, chemo, all that kind of stuff. And I tell that story because leading up to that point, I had no idea I was sick. I mean, looking back, I had some symptoms. I didn't feel really good when I ate, especially if I ate dairy products or spicy food. I just didn't feel good. I felt better hungry than I did after I ate. My energy level was down. I had begun losing weight a little bit, not anything extremely drastic or anything, but I didn't recognize any of those symptoms as warning signs that there was a bigger problem going on in my body. And I think that's where a lot of churches are today. There's a lot of warning signs, but those warning signs oftentimes get ignored or they get explained away. So attendance is down. Well, it's just we've had a lot of people die, or we've had a lot of people move away, or our congregation's older, we can't really do that anymore, or finances are down, or this or that. We just kind of explain away all of the different signs that says, hey, we've got a problem. We need to stop and we need to figure out what the problem is, but then we need to figure out how to fix the problem. And so I think that that's where we are in the condition of the church in America today, is a lot of churches are seeing warning signs. They're seeing the evidence of decline, but they don't recognize it as really the root problem that it is, and that is that our churches are sick. We really have a serious problem. And when I say that, I'm not talking at all about our polity or our theology or anything like that. I'm talking about in the programs and the things that we're doing, especially when it comes to reaching people with the gospel and discipleship and those sorts of things, all right? So the starting place is we have to focus on overall health, okay? I love church growth. I am not against church growth. In fact, I'm the president of a group called the Great Commission Research Network. We focus a lot on church growth. We do a lot of research and things like that in the area of church growth. So church growth is not a bad thing, but we need to take it from thinking about church growth in that, hey, we need to do this big event so we can have this, whatever happen or whatever, but just to think about overall health. And we don't always like to think about health because it's not always fun, right? So in order to be healthy, we have to eat right, right? I mean, that means not into the good stuff. I always wondered why God didn't make donuts taste bad and green beans taste amazing, right? I mean, I like green beans, okay, but like if I have a choice, do I want a donut or green beans? The donut's going to always win, but that's not healthy. And you can't have a steady, constant diet of that, or there's going to be problems, right? It's not going to take too long, and you're going to have diabetes and heart problems and high blood pressure and all those kinds of things. So you have to focus on overall health. To be healthy, I have to exercise. Boy, how much fun is that, right? There's nothing better to think about, oh, I need to go work out, or I need to go take a run, or I need to go... none of that stuff is fun, but we have to do that to maintain overall good physical health. And the same thing's true in our churches, but we need to focus first on spiritual elements. And so I don't deal with a lot of this stuff when we get into the actual systems because I'm assuming that we understand this from the spiritual aspect, okay? None of the systems are any good. None of the systems are any value. Nothing will work if it's not backed by the spiritual side of things, okay? We have to have the power of the Holy Spirit. If you can have the best programs, you can have the hardest working people, you can have the best plan, but if the Holy Spirit's not in it, it's not going to happen, okay? So I understand that. I believe that. But again, I don't want it to seem too clinical when we get to the other side of it here in a moment. We do understand these things going in, that the spiritual element, the spiritual factors have to be there in order to have overall health. That includes things like prayer, fasting, the spiritual warfare, all those types of things. But then there's the mechanical elements that we have to look at to maintain overall health, okay? So churches need to take a look at their legal documents. So we need to look at things like our incorporation, our constitution and bylaws. Your constitution and bylaws, I deal with this in the book. Again, I don't have time to really deal with it, but it's just so important that I mention that your constitution and bylaws are really the legal working document or the charter for your church. If there's ever a serious problem, if somebody ever files a lawsuit against your church, or if somebody gets, mad or at your church because of a lifestyle choice or whatever, if you don't have an up-to-date and a good constitution and bylaws, your church as a corporation, if you're incorporated, if you're not incorporated, I would never recommend that, but if you're not incorporated, and I still hear about churches that aren't, you as the pastor and your board could be legally liable for lawsuits and things like that. So incorporation is important. Your constitution and bylaws are important. Your tax-exempt status, you're automatically covered through, if you're a member in good standing, through the national, but it's a good idea too, especially if you pay employees and that sort of thing, to have your own 501c3. There's just a lot of things to that help maintain that overall health in all those mechanical elements. But then there's the church assessment side, and this is not always fun, but it's kind of like in the body description or the talking about health. It's kind of like going to the doctor for that physical. How many of you look forward and like going to your physical? All right, nobody likes that because, well, first of all, they make you undress to a certain point that's uncomfortable. They do things that aren't always really comfortable. They stick you with needles and probe you with all kinds of things. That's just not fun, but it's necessary, right? We all do it, not because we enjoy it, but we do it because it's important, and we know that we need to have that for overall health. And the same is true with church assessment. We need to assess everything about our churches. Now, this is a little bit difficult a lot of times because we love our churches, hopefully. Especially if you're a pastor or leader, you love your church. You think your church is the greatest church around. You should think that. You should feel that way. But then again, we also should recognize and be honest enough to say, hey, we need to really honestly assess our church to see if we are being the most effective that we possibly can be. And so you need to do that by assessing your facilities. That's one of the easier ones because you basically, and I have a section in the book about this, explain how to do this and kind of have a checklist that you can go through. But basically, you need to walk before you even walk in, you need to see your church from the eyes of a first-time guest, okay? When they walk in, or before, again, even they walk in, what about, and we'll get into more of this later, but your online presence. Most young people are going to check you out online before they ever come to your church. But then when they do get there, do they know where to park? Is it clear how they are supposed to come in? Or, are there just unwritten rules? Are there doors that are never unlocked because people don't use those? Or just all that kind of stuff. You just need to do a facilities assessment and make sure that your signage is good, make sure that your buildings are up to par. And I know you can't always afford to do a complete remodel, but I basically say just do the best you can with what you've got. And then update as you can, change as you can, all those types of things. But with facilities assessment is very important. But then also doing leadership assessments. These are really hard because they involve people, and they involve personalities, and they involve emotions and all that. But I really believe, and I pastored for a long time, I was involved in local church ministry. I'm still involved in local church ministry. I'm not a pastor now, but have been involved in local church ministry pretty much my whole life. And I do believe this statement is true. There's a lot of people in leadership positions in your church that shouldn't be. And the reason they're there is because they're willing, or they volunteer, but they're not really in the right place. And so there's a lot of turnover, there's a lot of frustration, there's a lot of not really great results and all of that. And so we need to be honest enough to say, okay, we're going to really look at our leadership. Are our teachers really, are they teaching the ages they should be, that they're gifted to teach? Do they really want to be there, or do they feel like they have to do it because no one else is willing? Nursery workers, are they only there because they feel obligated? All these different things, leadership assessments, and just saying, is everybody really in the right ministry, the right job for their gift and their calling and their personality? We dealt with personalities last night, but it goes much deeper than that when it comes to even just spiritual giftedness and things like that. People need to be serving where they're gifted. People need to be serving where they're called, and it will be a lot better for everybody. But then also assessing your worship services. Do you do the same thing you've always done just because that's the way you've always done it? We'll get more into that too in a little bit. But even assessing our ministries. Are all of our ministries that we're currently doing, are they helping us fulfill our mission? What is our mission as a church? It's to make disciples. It is to win people to Christ and make disciples. The Great Commission, I believe that is every church's mission. That's why we're on this planet. That's why churches exist, is to make disciples. And so do all of our ministries help us fulfill that mission or that calling? If not, then we need to maybe stop doing some things. We need to start making some things better that we're currently doing, and maybe we need to kill some things that we're doing that we just can't afford to do. We don't have the people to do it or whatever. And those are tough decisions to make and all of that, but we need to do a real honest ministry assessment. So I already hit on this a little bit, but knowing your mission, your vision, your core values is important. I don't have time to get into that. You can read that section in the book. And since you're all getting a book, you can do that. And then just focusing on church health. So again, focusing on the overall health of your church, it's going to allow your church to grow more naturally. It's not a fix-all. It's not a guaranteed 1, 2, 3, steps 1, 2, 3, and instant success. It is nothing like that. You know how this works. But these things will at least give you the structure and the foundation that you need to be able to then add those elements that will help your church grow. So we're going to talk now about the actual systems and what we mean by systems. And so my definition of systems, and there's a lot of different definitions if you were to look it up on dictionary.com or whatever, but basically systems, for my purpose and in the book, it's individual structural components that are working together to function as a whole. So the best way to explain that is to think about the human body. So the human body has a lot of different systems, right? We have the circulatory system, the endocrinology system, whatever, probably not the right word, but muscular system, all these different systems, and all of those systems operate independently. They're all important on their own, but they have to be functioning together in order to make your body healthy, right? We understand that. Another way to look at it is to think about a chain. So each system is like a link in a chain, but a chain link isn't really a chain until you put them together, right? And so when you think about the links of a chain being hooked together, that's kind of the definition of systems. Independent structural components that are working together to create a whole. Okay, not whole, H-O-L-E, but a W-H-O-L-E, a whole thing. So that's kind of the definition that we're working from on systems. So there are what I have identified as 8 essential systems. And these are things that I believe that every church needs to have in order to be healthy and to have that overall health. Now again, I'm talking as fast as I can and taking a few breaths between, and we've got a lot of stuff to cover, and so we'll do the best we can to kind of just do the 30,000-foot flyover. So system number 1 is outreach. Outreach is the only way that your church will ever see long-term sustainable growth. We've got to be looking outside, right? We'll have some babies born in our church. We'll have some people that will move in and all of that, but we've got to focus on outreach in our church. And that's really what the Great Commission is about, right? It says that we are to go and make disciples. Matthew 28, go ye therefore, teach all nations, baptizing them, teaching them. And that's what the real crust of the Great Commission is go and make disciples. Jesus told his disciples that he would make them fishers of men. Well, how do we fish? We stay at home and we just wait for the fish to come to us? No, we don't do that, right? We have to bait a hook. Well, first of all, we have to get all the preparations ready. We go out on the bank or in a boat. We bait the hook. We throw it out. We, bob the lure around, whatever. I'm not really a fisherman, so I don't know all the terminology. But anyway, I get the general idea, right? You have to go after the fish. You have to go where they are. You're not going to catch any fish in the middle of a field, right? So we understand all of that. And that's the way outreach is. We are to go out into the world to make disciples. And so there's a lot of things about outreach that is a part of it that you may not even think about when you think about outreach, but it's things like your church logo. And you say, well, we don't have a logo. You need a logo. You need something that people, especially younger generations, millennials and Gen Z, we're going to talk about this more in a session a little bit later on today about reaching different generations. But different generations just think differently. And younger generations, if you want to reach younger people, then you have to know how they think. And they're going to identify logos. And logos are a big deal, right? I mean, we don't have time to do this, but I could flash up some logos on the screen and you would instantly know what they represent. People need to do that with your church. They need to be in your community, and when they see this particular image, they go, oh yeah, that's that church that's over here. They may not know the name, they may not know what you do, they may not know anything about your doctrine or your service times or your address, but they can identify it with something. We did this when I was pastoring. And in Oklahoma, we created a logo. We put it on everything, every door hanger, our bulletins, our little tent that we had to set up at festivals and different things in the community where people recognized our logo. It's important that they recognize your church in the community. And then a social media strategy. If you don't have social media, you are missing the single greatest opportunity to reach your community with the gospel. Just say it. Disagree with me if you want to. I know some people hate social media. I don't particularly like social media. I really don't. I don't spend a lot of time on it. And I've threatened 1,000 times to get off of it, especially when somebody hacks my account and creates problems or whatever. But man, everybody's on social media. Okay? And you say, well, I'm not. Well, you may be an exception, but I mean, everybody else is on social media. And there's the data and the statistics out there to prove it. Even younger people, and Dr. Moody has some statistics on this. Facebook gets a bad rap, but everybody's on Facebook. And so even if it's not their number one social media choice or the one they check daily, everybody's on Facebook, and it's a great place to start. But if your church doesn't have a social media strategy, then it's missing out on a great opportunity to reach people. Again, plug for Dr. Moody and the executive office what they're doing, but they have a great social media strategy built for your church. They'll give it to you. You can use it. And so I encourage you, create a church page and take advantage of the resources the executive office puts out. You can add your own touches to that or whatever. But social media is so important. And then also a website. Your church needs a website. It needs an up-to-date website. And I think it needs those things working together. Your website can be more static. It doesn't change as much. It can be more basic information, where your social media is what you update more often. But again, if you want people to come to your church, they're going to check it out online before they ever show up, and so you need that website. Then how you advertise, the events you have, all those sorts of things, is all a part of outreach. Then when we think about outreach, we typically think about events, right? And there are two major types of events. There's on-site events, things that you do at your church, and there's off-site events, things that you do in the community. Both are important, and I think it's important to have a strategy, and that's what building a system is about. So a part of your outreach strategy or your outreach system, you would sit down with a team, hopefully, and you would say, okay, we need to plan some on-site events because you want people to come to your facility, to your building. And whether that's your fall festival for kids, or it's VBS, or it's some kind of special services, or whatever it might be, anything you do on your church property is an on-site event. But then, so you say, okay, we want to do 2 or 3 on-site events every year. So you put that on the calendar. You start assigning tasks. You start, recruiting help for that. Whatever, you appropriate money in the budget. All those sorts of things. So you're building an event as a part of your system or your strategy. And then you say off-site events. Okay, we want to do 2 or 3 off-site events every year. So we're going to go do a community outreach in the park, or we're going to hang door flyers, or we're going to give away bottled water at a city festival, or whatever that might be. So you start planning all those things, and you get it on the calendar. You recruit help. You build the teams. You appropriate the money. You do all the details. And so you are building an actual outreach strategy that includes both on-site and off-site events for your church. Now, every outreach event has 3 main components, and they're all 3 very, very important. The first one, obviously, is the planning, right? You can't have an event if you're not planning it. So you want to spend a good, significant amount of time planning for the event. And then once you finish the planning up, you have the event itself, which is the big day. It's the big, culmination of all that planning and all of that. And here's where I think most churches really miss it, because after the event, it's just kind of over. And you're missing the third element, but we've got to follow up. That is the gold in any event. And so whatever event you do, if it's an Easter egg hunt, if it's a special service, if it's anything you do on-site, this is harder to do off-site events, and sometimes we just have to touch the community, and we have to show our logo, and we have to, you can't always follow up on those types of events. I understand that. If you're handing out bottled water and you hand out 3,000 bottles of water at a city festival or whatever, obviously you probably can't follow up with all those people. But especially on-site events, when people come to your facility, you need to at least get their name, email address, and cell phone number. If you can get those 3 pieces of information, you have multiple ways that you can contact and follow up with people. And so you've got to be able to follow up with them. Just checking in with them. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Because system 2 then is connections, and I need to hurry. Also, it's important to mention, like on a chain, all of the links overlap, right? You've got one link that connects to the other one. And that's the way these systems are. They overlap. And so some things we talk about in connections looks like it kind of belongs in outreach because they go together. And so they overlap. So connections is basically, how are we going to connect people to our church? We've made that initial contact, whether it be online, or they've come to an event, or we've touched them in a community event, or they have actually visited our church or whatever. So what's first impressions like for your church? That's where the facilities assessment comes in. That's where making sure everything is the very best that it can possibly be. And really it starts before that first visit when they come to your actual facility, because again, you have to go back to the online presence and all those sorts of things. And so it starts way before the first visit. So then also following up with guests. How do you follow up with guests at your church? Let me just mention a resource. It's called Text in Church. It's an app. I do not personally have any knowledge of how to use Text in Church. A lot of our church planters that I work with use it. My church, where I attend in Nashville, uses it. It is a great resource. It is a subscription fee. You have to pay for it. But basically, you set it up ahead of time to where you tell it, like on Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock, send this specific text message. Monday at noon, send an email. Wednesday or Friday, send me a reminder to call these people or whatever. You set all this stuff up ahead of time, and then text in church when you have a first-time guest come to your church, or they come to an outreach event or whatever. You just put in their email address, their cell phone number, and all this stuff automatically happens. Okay, automatically on Sunday afternoon at 3 o'clock, everybody that was visiting your church, or everybody that came to that event gets a text message. At 6 o'clock on Friday, you're going to get a reminder to call all these people to invite them back to church on Sunday, whatever, however you set it up. So text in church is a great resource. Again, there's a cost associated with it, but it is a huge help in a connections or some type of an assimilation process. Then let me just mention this really quickly, because I think it's so important, and we give so little thought to it. But how do we follow up, or how does your church follow up with first-time guests? Most churches have some kind of a card. Do we have a card? In the pew, or okay, so we got it, okay. And so a lot of times the pastor will say, hey, we want to welcome any first-time guests. If you're here, we'd like for you to fill out this card. So we do that with first-time guests. But did you know that statistically, you have a very, very small chance of winning a person that just comes to your church one time? It's just a low percentage. It's just a discouraging statistic, but it's just a statistic that's true. But if they come back a second time, that exponentially increases on the likelihood of them becoming a regular full-time attender of your church. But if they come back 3 times, it really goes up. But the problem with that is very, very few churches that I know of even track second or third-time guests. They only track first-time guests. And so the way we did it at our church was we had a balcony in our church similar to this, and we had a lady that would sit up in the balcony, and she would basically had a roll sheet. And she would check on people, that regular attenders. We knew every Sunday they were there, and every Sunday that they missed, we knew that. But also she would identify new people. Then we had section greeters, and we had 3 sections of pews, and we had like 3 section greeters in each section, and they were responsible because people, are creatures of habit. They basically sit in the same section, and so if the section greeter didn't recognize somebody in their section, their job was to go to them and say, hey, are you new here? And they say, well, yeah, we're new, but we've been here, for a few months. Then, okay, they're regular enough that they probably don't need to be in the system. But then say, hey, are you new here? Yeah, we've been here once before. This is our second time or whatever. Perfect. So then you start identifying second-time guests, third-time guests, whatever. And you have a way to track that, because you can be a lot more aggressive in following up with a second or a third-time guest than you can a first-time guest. Okay, so again, it's just a system. You need to figure it out, whatever works for your church. However your church can do it, you need to have a way to identify these different things and then follow up on all these different things. So then another part of connections is, how are you going to create disciples? Now, this is its own system in a minute too, so I'm just going to mention it here and go on. But what is your process, basically, in your church from somebody being a very first-time guest to becoming a fully developed, devoted follower of Jesus Christ? You need to have a plan. How are we going to take a first-time guest, and how are we going to get them involved in everything that our church does? Most churches don't have that kind of a plan, but you should. You should have a plan of how you're going to move them through that process. It includes things like, and again, this is just broad pictures, ideas. LifeTrack, you may not be familiar with LifeTrack. LifeTrack is basically a new beginners kind of class. Generally short, 3 to 4 weeks. Some churches have a little bit longer or whatever. But it's basically to invite everybody, hey, we want you to start out by coming to LifeTrack. We want you to start by coming to our new attenders, or whatever you call it, class. It's good to have it the same time that you have Sunday school or small groups, so that once they finish up LifeTrack and they've created a little bit of a habit, okay, they've come 4 weeks in a row to LifeTrack, and now we want to move you over into a Sunday school class or a small group. And so you're just trying to move people along that pathway of just showing up to church for the first time. Now we have something we are inviting you to, not just, hey, come to Sunday school, but will you come this Sunday, because we're starting a new cycle of LifeTrack, and we want you to learn about our church. We want to get to know you better. We want you to know about what we're here to do. So would you come this Sunday? And so you get them started, and each week is very intentional about how you move them through life track, and then getting them involved in a small group or Sunday school class. Hopefully getting them then involved in a D group or discipleship group, which is a smaller group where they're really digging in their Bibles, training them for ministry so they can take on roles and responsibilities. Hopefully then sending them on mission where they're actually going out into their neighborhoods, they're sharing their faith at work, and all those sorts of things. And so it's a connections pathway of how the first time they show up to your church to how they actually are going out on mission. We need to have a plan to how to do that for all of our churches. So how are people in your church going to know the process? You have to develop that pathway. System number 3 is discipleship. This is another really big one, and we're already out of time, and so I need to move really quickly. But discipleship basically is how is your church going to make disciples? So it goes kind of what we were talking about in connections of moving them through that process, but now how are we going to really make people into disciples? How are we going to move them off of the milk of the word and get them into the meat of the word, okay? And so what does that discipleship look like? Well, I think a great place to start is the Bible. What does discipleship look like in the Bible? You need to figure that out. I don't have even in the book, I don't have a step 1, 2, 3, 4 and say this is your system, because every church is different. What works in my church won't work in your church and vice versa. So the principles are the same, but the actual meat on the bones, if you will, has to change in every local church, in every context. So you have to figure out what discipleship is going to look like in your context and then figure out what the specific steps are that are involved in making disciples. It includes things like classes. We talked about these, the life track, the small groups, the discipleship groups, all of that. But discipleship is also about what you preach from the pulpit as a pastor, what you're teaching from the classroom. All of those things need to be intentional towards making disciples. And I think that I pastored for a long time. I preached every Sunday morning, Sunday night, Wednesday night. And I'll just be honest, and maybe I'm the only one that's ever done this, but I found myself many times just looking for something to preach. You're busy or whatever, so you're finding a message, you're hearing from God, hopefully, but we're just kind of finding messages. But what if we really developed every message with the thoughtful intent of we're going to be making disciples? We're going to really focus everything that we do on making disciples. I think it could be revolutionary in our preaching. And then our children's ministry, youth ministry, everything we do focusing that. Here's a shameless plug for D6. I love D6 curriculum because it does that. It has the family discipleship thing. I think it's ready-made. It's a gift to you that D6 has done. And I encourage you to look at that and use it. I don't get any money for that. I don't get anything for that plug. I just do believe in it. And I think it's really helpful to have that kind of family dynamic, but then everything focusing on making disciples. Even your special events, all those sorts of things. System 4 is worship planning. Again, we're going to move quickly, but this is an interesting statistic I saw not too long ago. And Dr. Moody has seen some of this in kind of their research and work they've been doing on the great de-churching. If you're familiar with that book or heard about that, not everybody that isn't going to church is mad at the church. Not everybody that doesn't go to church doesn't believe in God. But 23% of people move and just can't find a church that's right for them. That's a quarter of the people. So it's not that people are adverse to church. It's not that people are mad at the church. It's just that people just haven't really found a church that they fit into or that they like. There's an old book by Tom Rainer called Surprising Insights from the Unchurched that was really helpful to me when I was pastoring. It just says, hey, you know what? There's just little tweaks we can make and little things that we can do that will make your church more desirable. Not that it's about being culturally, cool or whatever. It's not about that. But hey, we do want people to come to visit our churches, right? And so we want to make it as attractive as we can, and there are just some simple things that we can do in worship planning. In my experience in visiting over 300 different Free Baptist churches in the last 17 years that I've been doing what I'm doing now, and when I was a state mission director in Oklahoma, is that really little thought is put into our Sunday morning services. It really is. I mean, we kind of use a template and we just plug in new songs and new sermons, but it's basically the same thing every week for years and years and years and years. There's not necessarily anything bad about that other than it gets very routine. It gets very just going through the motions. And sometimes we need to just change things up, okay? Maybe you need to change your setup or decor, your order of service, your sermon topics, whatever. But just creating connections with people and in the worship planning to where it's not just, oh, now I know we're going to sing verses 1, 2, and 4, and we're going to stand at this particular point. We're going to sit down at that point because that's what we do every Sunday. And so I'm not saying overturn the apple cart. I'm not saying go home and get fired because you change everything in 1 week. I've seen that happen. Don't do that. But I'm just saying think through it. And we don't have, there's as far as I know, and I've read my Bible from cover to cover, including the index and the maps. I've read it all. And there's nowhere in the Bible that I know of that says you have to do a song and then a welcome and announcements and 2 more songs and then take up the offering. And, it's just kind of our culture. It's what we do. And we don't have to necessarily do it that way if it's going to create more interest and if it's going to help people connect more with the gospel. If you fail to connect with people, then you will fail to connect them to the church. System 5 is financial. Again, a big one. Really quickly, you'll have to look at it in the book, but it includes things like budget, reporting, receipts, thank you letters. I wish I could unpack some of that, but I don't have time. Who has authority to spend money? Doing an internal audit at your church to make sure that the accountability is there, those safety measures are in place, having some type of an annual stewardship emphasis. Creating multiple ways to give. COVID taught us this, right? Even as smaller rural churches, a lot of people don't carry cash. Young people don't even have checks, which I don't understand that, but because we still have checks, but a lot of people don't. And so you've got to have multiple ways for people to give, an app, a text to give, an online opportunity, whatever, different ways for people to give. Doing what we call a tithe talk or a generous living moment. Just basically take 1 minute before you pick up the offering and just say what the offering is for. Because honestly, a lot of people in your church doesn't know what your offering is for. They think it just pays your salary and keeps the lights on. But if you say, hey, just want to let you know through your generosity and through your giving, we were able to support the Crisis Pregnancy Center in town by providing resources for them, or we were able to partner with North American Ministries and help plant churches in Hickory and across the U.S. In North America. And because we support the World Missions Offering, and because we support IM, we're able to help plant churches and support partners and ministries all around the world. And because of your generosity, we're able to do this and do that. Get it outside of your local church, and it's going to appeal to a lot more people. And so just letting people know what your offering really is. And then I believe that churches should be generous. We want our people to be generous. Amen. We want them to be cheerful givers. We want them to love to support and be good stewards of what God has blessed them with. Well, shouldn't we as churches do that? We should be giving churches. We should give to our denomination. We should support our denominational ministries. I work for one. I don't have to say that. I did it even before I worked for a denominational entity. I just believe that we should do that. We should support our colleges. We should support our family. We need to be generous outside the church. System 6 is member care. This is really kind of an easy one, but basically it's just how do we care for the church? How do we care for the flock? How do we care for the sick, the shut-ins, the widows, orphans, the needy, the hurting? You need to have some kind of a plan. Does that all fall on you as the pastor? Or do we have deacons that help do this, or do our Sunday school teachers have some responsibility in this? What about if we have somebody that's identified that has a real mental health issue? Does the pastor have to try to deal with that, or can we pay for counseling for somebody in our church, or can we refer them? How do we deal with all these different types of things? Just having a plan for how you care for your church. System 7 is leadership. Your paid staff, again, going back to what I talked about in the mechanical elements earlier, your church needs to have a ministry description and a policy on how you handle situations in your church. God forbid, but what if the pastor has moral failure? What if he's lazy and just won't do his job? We need to have some kind of ministry description, and we need to have some kind of policy that says these are the ways that we're going to handle certain things in certain situations for all of our paid staff, but then also for volunteer staff, it needs to be the same thing. It may be a little different level, but we say our volunteer staff, everybody that works with kids has to be background checked. They have to go through this process. We have to do this interview, whatever it might be. These are the accountability structures. This is what we expect. This is what time you have to be here for these jobs. This is how long you're expected to serve. All those kinds of things need to be laid out in a leadership manual of some point. How are you going to recruit volunteers? This goes back again to what I was saying earlier about a lot of people are serving in the wrong places because we've just worried so much about the business meeting coming up where we've got to fill all those slots. And so anybody that's alive and breathing and will volunteer, we put them in a position, and they don't need to be in that position. And so we need to recruit volunteers for every ministry in our church, just, I think, the same way that we recruit a pastor. We need to pray about it. We need to check his references. We need to sit down with them through an interview process. We need to mentor them. We need to help them, whatever we need. How are we recruiting volunteers? Then system 8, we're going to be done real quick, is evaluation. So all these other things in place, you've got to have a way to continually evaluate, and evaluation has to constantly be going on in our churches. This is where a lot of systems shut down, is because we don't evaluate things. In other words, once something is kind of in motion, it just continually stays in motion until it dies on its own or whatever. But we need to evaluate things. We need to have a process for change. What if a teacher wants to paint their Sunday school classroom? Is that allowed? What hoops do they have to jump through to change something or whatever? You need to have staff meetings, and you may say, well, I'm the only staff at our church because we're a single staff. I'm not, that's fine, but you need to find out who your top level volunteers are, and at least once a month, maybe after a service at Sunday night or whatever, get your volunteer staff together and talk about things, evaluate things, give them an opportunity to input from their perspective, because their perspective is different than your perspective, and so get input and all of that kind of thing. So it's so important to have some kind of evaluation process. There's all kinds of tools that are available. There's online tools, programs, and apps, but then also scoreboards. And what I call scoreboards are things that we need to count. We need to count more than just attendance and finances, I believe. And in the book, I list 10 things that I think are important for us to count. I don't have time to talk about them now, but they're things that are really important. And then we need to understand what vicious cycles look like. In other words, once we get negative momentum going, it's hard to stop that, and we have to figure out how to insert some kind of a changing point so that we can stop the negative momentum and start positive momentum going. How do we do that? Again, I break that down in the book, and we talk about strategic planning.